this is something that, especially startups have to deal with all the time. It's like, how can we monetize this, but make it popular for our users, make it easy for our users? And there isn't really an answer, especially with the new regime of privacy laws and such. You can't necessarily just trade in free for a bunch of rights that people don't necessarily, or they used to not understand. I think there's greater understanding of the need to protect privacy.
I'm definitely always interested in these conversations of how business leaders should deal with balancing, obviously changing forces around them and obviously changing expectations and capabilities around them with their own business. And I think the word protect comes up a lot, right? The word, and that's a defensive word. And in some ways that actually, to me, feels wrong. If you're playing a defensive game, if you are protecting, then maybe you are doing something unnatural that is in the long run a losing game and isn't adapting to the expectation of your customers. Have you found yourself getting into
Right,
conversations
that's
like that?
interesting.
It actually sounds like your first role at Getty was right at the heart of that issue. Like they were playing a defensive game, and the CEO was like, "Well, this thing has a shot clock on it."
Yeah, yeah. I think it's definitely not black and white, right? There is the saying in sports that defense wins championships. So I think that there is value in playing defense, but you also need to score as well if you're gonna win. Um, I think that it is a balance. I think a lot of it has to do with public opinion as well, right? It's where do people think you are crossing the line to being and it with your defense being too aggressive, right? Like people don't like patent trolls, people don't like copyright trolls, because they have actually turned this idea of protecting work into a business stream,
Yeah.
and that doesn't feel right.
I think people also don't like friction. And I mean, so like, and this is me speaking from my own place, right? But the amount of anger I feel, and justified anger, because my anger is justified, right? When it is harder for me to pay for something like a music show than it is for me to obtain it by,
Oh,
let's say,
absolutely,
alternative
yeah.
means, like blows my mind, right? And that is, I think that's still one that's prevalent in sort of consumer media, right? Like you travel across borders, all of a sudden you can't watch stuff you've licensed or bought or what, there's stuff like that that frustrates people all the time. But I think it's also
Yeah.
creeping into B2B transactions. Like, there's an expectation in the world that technology and society should enable us to have frictionless access to everything out there. And that doesn't, that's maybe a little bit at odds to not just business models, but the people who have invested work and IP and hearts and souls and brains into this getting compensated.
Yeah.
That feels like a tension that is just going to get worse.
Yeah, well, I think, there's this idea of frictionless, and I think that you could also think about that as the idea that things should be free, right? And a lot of consumers, especially online consumers, have gotten this built into them, right? Where, it turns out it wasn't free to use like Facebook and other social media companies because you were paying with
That's
your
right.
privacy rights. Um, but there is a sense that, I should just be able to go on the internet and get whatever I want, and it should be easy. And I think that, if you're trying to commercialize these things that people want, you have somewhat of an incentive to create some friction, right? Like the concept of every startup wanting to have some sort of subscription service for their technology. That's great, right? It's like, oh, we'd love to have this recurring revenue. It looks great for our investors, but that creates a lot of friction for your customers, especially if like I just want to use one thing on your tool just once, but now I'm required to get an annual subscription to this. That's, at least in my opinion, that's a lot of friction. And this is something that especially startups, have to deal with all the time. It's like, how can we monetize this, but make it popular for our users, make it easy for our users? And there isn't really an answer, especially with the new regime of privacy laws and such. So you can't necessarily just trade in free for a bunch of rights that people don't necessarily, or they used to not understand. I think there's greater understanding of the need to protect privacy.